Hello everyone, my name is Greg and welcome to my channel, Midnight Oil Software. I'm going to be talking about Unity game development, and in this video, which is the first of what I hope will be several Unity game development videos, I'm going to be talking specifically about Unity's audio mixer groups and snapshots, and how you can use them to mix the different audio elements in your game. Everything from background music to ambient sound effects to more prominent sound effects, and how they can all be mixed into snapshots, which you can use to transition between mixes as your game state changes. So let me just transition over here to Unity. And you can see I've got a little demo project set up here. There's not much here. I have some ground, a player object, which is just a capsule with the main camera attached. And the reason the main camera is attached is because the camera has an audio listener. And I want to demonstrate how the audio changes as the player moves closer or farther to or from different audio sources. And then there's a little cube over there that represents an enemy, and he's going to have his own audio source and play different sound effects. But let's start off with music. In this demo project, I have a music folder under assets, and I have a few different songs that we can use in our game. I'm going to start with some start menu music. This is like when you imagine when the game first loads and you have a start menu where the player can choose to change settings or maybe view a tutorial or launch the game. This is what would come up first. And you can see it starts off just kind of somber, a little bit of kind of an Arabian feel to it. And if they stay on this track for long, it gets into more of a driving beat. It's kind of thematic, and I kind of like that for the start of a game. Once they join the game, and imagine this is a 3D space shooter where you're just flying around exploring space initially and there's no enemies around, we might have some peaceful music like this. You know, that gives you kind of a feel of the vastness of space, kind of a cosmic feel. And then, before long, some enemies come within range, and we can switch to this battle music. And it's got much more driving, intense feel that kind of communicates to the player, give them an audible cue that, hey, combat's about to start. And then, say the player gets killed and the game's over. You go to your game over screen where you might show your score and stats and things. We have some game over music. So just to demonstrate how we can have different types of music that can change dynamically as the game state changes. So how would I do this? Well, let's create a empty game object, and we're going to call this Music Manager. And the Music Manager is going to have 4 audio sources. Let's start off with just one initially. We'll start with the start game music. And we'll have it set to play on awake and loop. So as soon as the game starts, and as long as the game is playing, this will run. So we start the game, and right away you hear our start music playing. And that's great, but we want to have some different songs playing depending on different states of the game. So we'll go ahead and add our audio sources. And you're going to right away see an obvious problem. But each audio source is going to have its own music. So this one will have peaceful music, play on awake, loop. This one's going to have combat music or battle music, play on awake, loop. And finally, this one will have the game over music. And again, play on awake, loop. So all of these are going to start playing as soon as the audio source wakes, which as soon as the game starts, and they will loop continually. So that's not what we want in terms of we want these to change according to game state. So I'm going to introduce you to the audio mixer. You get to that by going to Window, Audio, Audio Mixer. And you can see right now we have no mixers. So if we hit this plus button here, let's create one, and we're going to call it Main Mix. And right away you see it creates a group, an audio mixer group called master. And that's going to be our master mix. And it also created a snapshot. Now, I want to rename this snapshot. I'm going to call it um, start menu. And while we're at it, let's go ahead and create the other snapshots I know we're going to want. We're going to want peaceful. We're going to want combat. And we're going to want game over. And if we go into these, right now there's only one audio mixer group, but let's create a group here and let's call it start menu music. And let's create another one and we'll call it peaceful music. And another one, we don't want it to be a child of peaceful music. We'll go ahead and rename it first. We'll call this one combat music. And let me just move it so it's a sibling and not a child. And then finally, game over music. So if we go back to our music manager and we go to our audio sources, you'll see that none of these are outputting to a specific mixer group. So we're going to have the start menu music output to the start menu music mixer group. We're going to have our peaceful music output to the peaceful music menu group. And we're going to have battle music go to combat music. And we're going to have game over music go to game over music. If you look at the snapshots here, you'll notice start menu has a star next to it. That means that's our default or start snapshot. And in this snapshot, I want to set everything except start menu music to 0. So basically, the only thing playing right now in this snapshot is the start menu. And it's the same thing for peaceful. We want to turn everything off except for peaceful music. For combat, we'll turn everything off except for combat music. And for game over, you get the picture. Now if we start our game, all you should hear is the start menu music. And you can even see right here on the mixer that's all that is playing. Now if I go to edit and play mode and switch to a different snapshot, you can see that I'm transitioning to the different mixes based on that snapshot. Okay, so that's great. We have music, and we have separate music for the different game states, and we have different snapshots for those game states. And they're all controlled by different mixes. Well, it'd be nice to be able to change that from code. And so let's create a game object, and we're going to call it Snapshot Manager. And we're going to create a C# script. We're going to call that Snapshot Manager. And we're going to drag it onto our game object there. Let's open up the editor here and we will look at our script. Okay, so right now you can see this is just an empty game object. The very first thing we're going to want to do is we want to create a list of audio mixer snapshots. And we'll call these snapshots. And we're also going to want a float that we're going to call transition delay. And we want that delay to default to 1 second. And these are going to be serializable fields so that we can change them in the inspector. And we're going to make this one a range. I want it to go from 0, which would be instantaneous, to 5 seconds. So that will control the delay, how long it takes to transition between snapshots. If we go back to Unity, you'll see that we now have this list of snapshots and this transition delay slider on our snapshot manager. So let's go ahead and create 4 elements for our snapshot list. And we can just select Start Menu, Peaceful, Combat, and Game Over. Go back into our script, and we don't really need to do anything in Start. But in the Update method, I want to allow the user to change between, since this is just a demo, normally you'd probably use something like a state machine that would change state depending on whether or not enemies are near, or whether you're on the start menu or you're in the game or whatever. For the sake of the demo, all I'm going to do is let the user switch between game states by pressing the number keys 1 through 4. So I'm going to create a little for loop here. We're going to loop through the size of our snapshots. And I want to add a public method, transition to snapshot. And the reason I'm doing this is because if we were going to use a state manager or something outside of this script, it would need a way to call into this to change the snapshot. And all you would do is you would say snapshots dot transition to transition delay. And in here, we'll call that method, we'll pass in I, and then we'll break out of the loop. And actually, what we want to do is we want to say if input.getKeyDown, key code alpha1 plus I. And let's see. So we're going to loop through all of our elements in our snapshot list. And if the user pressed 1, we're going to switch to snapshot 0. If he pressed 2, we're going to switch to snapshot 1, and so forth. Let's go back to Unity. Okay, so if we hit play to start our game, you'll see that the start menu music is playing. And if I hit 2, we switch over to the peaceful music. If I hit 3, you see it switches over to combat music. And if I hit 4, it switches over to game over music. And so I can toggle between these states just by hitting the number keys. So that shows you how you can easily switch between snapshots based on game state within your game. That's great for music, but we want sound effects. Let's go up to this player here. And what are some of the sound effects we've got? In this project under assets, I have some bridge sounds. So these are sort of a ambient background noise like you might hear on the bridge of the Enterprise. You hear that like chirping. There's a little bit of a low rumble, like like you would hear if they're flying through space. So we're going to want to add that to our player. And I could add it directly to the player, but just to show you how easy it is to componentize things in Unity, we'll create an empty game object, and we'll call it bridge. And we're going to add a component, an audio source. And this is going to be another one of those where the audio clip will loop constantly. So it will play on awake and loop. Oh, but we need an output to send it to. We don't want to send it to one of these music mixers. So let's go back to our audio mixer, and under groups, let's create player sound effects. And, this is probably overkill, but I'm going to create a child of that, and I'm going to call it ambient sounds. And while I'm in here, just sound effects. So this will give us those bridge sounds. Actually, I want another one. I want to have engine sounds. So let's go back up to our bridge. We're going to pick ambient sounds as our output. So play on awake, loop, route it to ambient sounds. If I hit play, there you can see I've got my start menu music and I've got my ambient sounds. And as I switch game states, you can see that we get the sound in all of them. So let's take a look at our different snapshots. So these levels are all the same for every snapshot except for the music. Let's say in combat, we want to pull the ambient sounds down a little bit. And on game over, say we don't want player sound effects at all. So let's just pull them all the way down. So now, and you know what? On start menu, we don't want any player sound effects on the start menu either. So really, we only want them on peaceful, and we want them to be a little bit, the ambient sounds to be a little bit softer under combat. So let's see how that works. Start menu. All I've got is the music, no player sound effects. Peaceful. We got our peaceful music, and we got our player sound effects. But you know what? That music's a little loud. Let's pull that back. Maybe. So you're starting to see how we can get a good control of our mix while we're in here. Switch to combat. Let's see. Pull that music back. I kind of like that. So that's good. We got some music, we got some ambient sound effects, and let's add our engine noise. So come over here to player, create empty. We'll call it thruster. And we're going to add a component. We're going to add an audio source. But we're not going to give it an audio clip, and we don't want it to play on awake. We're going to assign it to engines. And we're going to want a script for this. So let's go back into our scripts folder, create a C# script, call it fire thruster, and let's drag it onto our thruster component. And we'll go edit that. One thing we're going to want to do, we are going to want them to be able to specify the audio clip. And then in update, I want to actually have a bool here. I want to have a private bool thrust on, defaulting to false. And then if the user hits the, we'll say the W key, so that's kind of like the ASDW convention where you would use W to thrust forward. I want to toggle thrust on. And if thrust on and not, actually, so I have thrust on. If the audio, we need our audio source. Now we can make the audio source assignable in the inspector like this, but I'm actually going to show you another way to get the audio source. I'll add our start method back. And I will say audio source equals get component audio source. So if not audio source is playing, then we want to play. Actually, we don't need to specify our audio clip here. I'm getting this confused with our other sound effects. I apologize. All we really need them to specify is the audio source. We're going to assign the audio clip to our audio source directly in the inspector. So here, if thrust on and we're not already playing, we're going to set the audio source to play. Otherwise, if we're not thrusting, if the audio source is playing, we're going to turn it off with stop. All right, let's go back into Unity. Let's go up to our audio source. Let's go ahead and pick the thrust fire audio. Let's play. And I'll hit W. It looks like it's playing. Oh, I know why. It shows that our snapshots are working. Yes. So if I toggle the thrust on, you can hear the engine come on. So probably I'm going to want that to be a little bit louder, I think. As you can really tell that the ship is thrusting. Go over to combat. And that's probably good. It probably sits a decent enough level in the mix there. You can still hear it. And then game over, we shouldn't hear it at all. Perfect. Okay, so we've got music, we've got some ambient background sound effects, and we've got our thruster sound effects. Let's add weapons. So let's create another empty game object. We're going to call this player weapons. And we're going to create another C# script. We're going to call it fire player weapons. And we want to assign it to our player weapons component. You know, the simplest way to do this is to have a separate component for each weapon. So let's do it this way. Let's have an audio clip and a weapon sound or mouse button. And we're going to need an audio source. And now, in this case, I'll show you how you can do this through the inspector. So for the last one, we got the audio source using get component. For this one, we're going to provide it in the inspector. So we'll say audio source dot play one shot weapon sound. Okay, so now let's go back into Unity. Look at our script here. The audio source will actually be the weapon, and I'm going to rename this. I'm going to rename this to laser. This is another good example of how you can componentize everything. Laser should have an audio source. No clip, no play on awake. It will be assigned to sound effects. So now I can just drag it onto itself. For our weapon sound, we'll pick laser. For mouse button, it will be 0, which is the left mouse button. Let's give that a try. So as I click the mouse, you can hear the laser. But it's barely audible. So let's see what we can do about that. First of all, I want to go back and look at that. So we have our audio source. It's going. Somehow I did not set it to sound effects. Okay, there we go. Edit and play mode. Turn that up. Okay, that's pretty good. Switch over to combat, and we'll probably want to turn this up much higher. Good, so we've got our lasers. Let's duplicate this, and we'll call it torpedo. And all we got to do is change the audio clip. Did I duplicate the wrong one? I think I duplicated the wrong one. Delete that. I want to duplicate laser. Rename that torpedo. Change the sound clip to be torpedo and the mouse button to be 1, and it's going to sound effects. Let's try that. So in peaceful mode, you don't hear any sound effects. So here's our laser. Here's our torpedoes. So we've got background music, we've got ambient background sounds, we've got our thruster engine sound, and we've got weapon sounds for the player. The last thing I want to show is how we can add sounds to the enemy. So let's add, we'll add an audio source directly to this enemy object. No audio clip, no play on awake. We're going to output it to, let's add a new group here. I just realized we don't have one for enemies. Enemy sound effects. So let's come over here to our enemy. We're going to output him to enemy sound effects. So there we go. Oh, and one more important thing I want to do for the enemy sound effects. There's this spatial blend setting. We've been leaving this to 2D for all our other sounds, for our music, for our player sounds. But for the enemies, we want to put that all the way up to 1. And that's going to make the sound be positioned spatially relative to the location of the player. So this guy has his audio source. The player, by virtue of the main camera, has an audio listener. As that audio listener moves towards or away from the audio source on the enemy, you're going to hear the sound get louder and softer. And we could even play around with things like the Doppler level. You know how like when a fire engine goes by, the siren sound changes in pitch as it's moving away from you. So you could get a little bit of that if we wanted to play around with that. So let's go over to our enemy. We'll collapse this audio source. And let's create a C# script. And I'm going to call this play random sound. So we're going to have a serialized field that's going to be an audio clip. If I can type. And let's see. Keep this simple. I'm going to have a private method here called play sound. And we're going to want an audio source. We're going to say audio source, play one shot, audio clip. And in the update method, I'm going to do an invoke, which is basically just a delayed invocation of a method. We're going to call that play sound. And we're going to give it a random range of 1/4 of a second to 2 seconds. So basically, somewhere between 1/4 of a second and 2 seconds, it's going to play that random sound. And after it plays it, it's going to do it again. All right, go back into Unity. I'm going to assign that script to our enemy. Actually, I want to create under our enemy, I'm going to create an empty. And I'm going to call this laser. I'm going to drag our play random sound up there. We're going to give it the enemy as our audio source. And the audio clip is going to be laser. And then let's duplicate that and call it torpedo. And everything's going to be the same except torpedo. So if we go into our snapshots, we have this enemy sound. I'm going to go ahead and crank that up. Actually, in peaceful, we shouldn't have any enemies. But in combat, we want those enemies to be nice and loud. So we're going to put that up. I'm going to turn our combat music down just a little bit. Going to hit play. Apparently, start menu has the enemies turned up. We don't want that. And game over doesn't want them turned up either. Game over also doesn't want engines. Although they would be under player sound effects, so that wouldn't matter anyhow. Let's see. Okay, I stopped the video. I was having some issues. I realized I made a mistake here. In our play random sound script, I'm calling this invoke over and over and over again from update. This is getting called every frame. We want this in awake. Okay, so we want to call this once from awake, and then it will get called again after that delay, a 1/4 second to 2 second delay. So let's go back into Unity now and switch to combat. So you can hear the weapon sound firing from the enemy. If I grab my player, you don't hear much difference in the level of the sound. Now, why is that? Well, that's because we need to configure our audio source on our enemy. I mentioned how we turned that spatial blend all the way up. Well, one thing we didn't change was how fast that sound rolls off. So we're going to want to roll that off quite a bit quicker than that. We want to go at least from a minimum distance of 0. Well, actually from 1 is probably fine. And then as you move farther and farther away, it quickly start to roll off with this curve here. So let's go back, hit play, switch to combat, so you can hear those weapon sounds firing. You hear it getting quieter and quieter, and it even went down in pitch some as that Doppler effect kicked in. So I'll move it back up, closer to the enemy. I just realized I was moving the enemy, not the player. So here you can really see as we get close to the enemy, it gets much louder. And you can hear the sound pan So you can play around with these values to change how quickly it rolls off and how close you have to be to hear the sound. Like, let's make that a 20. Switch back to our player, combat. Cool. So let's add one more thing here. Let's add a game object. I'm going to call it Explosion. You may remember actually I didn't add one, did I? Let's add another audio mixer group and we'll call it Explosions. And on start menu, we want that to be all the way down. Peaceful, all the way down. Combat, all the way up. Game over, all the way down. So let's go to this guy. Add an audio source. Send it to the Explosions mixer. We're going to turn that spatial blend all the way up. Have it roll off from 1 to 20. And we're going to add that same script, that play random sound script. For the audio source, we'll pick Explosion. And then for our audio clip, I've got an explosion sound here. So to hear what that sounds like. So now we want to move that explosion object somewhere on the other side of our scene, away from the player. Put them way over there. I should be seeing some output here. Oh, there we go. So it is playing. We grab our player. Where are you, player? You hear those explosions. So there you can see how the explosions gets louder as the player gets closer to the audio source, and they get softer as it moves farther away. So here we've got 4 snapshots with individual mixes of all the different audio sources that we have in our game. So we have audio mixer groups for different types of sounds where we can group like all our player sound effects together with different subdivisions under here. So we have all our different types of sounds mixed for different game states that we can switch, transition to with different times. Now, one thing that we didn't look at, our snapshot manager, we have this transition delay. So we'll go ahead and demonstrate that real quick. I'll switch from peaceful to combat, or from start menu to peaceful to combat to game over. So that's instantaneous. You put this up to 3 seconds. Oh. You can see the transition is much longer. So you can control the delay between transitions with that float parameter. So there we go. I think that is a pretty good demonstration of how you can use the Unity audio mixers and the snapshots to get a good mix for your game where everything kind of sits nicely in the mix. You can tailor that. Maybe in another video, I'll go into more detail about all the different effects that you can add to your different mixer groups. You can add compression and you can add reverb, equalization, all kind of different things that can really add to the post processing of the audio for your game. So I don't know if you're into sound engineering or anything like that, but if you are, um, put a note in the comments saying if that's something you're interested in. And if this video has been helpful, if you find this topic interesting and would like to see more, or if you have any suggestions or advice for me, like I said, this is my first video and I hope to do more. So I'm really looking for feedback. Please put some comments in and subscribe to the channel. And if you're up to it, maybe share it to your social media or with any of your friends that you think might be interested. Anyway, thank you so much for watching, and I hope to see you in the next video.